Welcome to this new automotive news video for Friday, April 3rd, 2026. Today, we're going to talk about the French government preparing for the return of the LEZs. We thought we had gotten rid of them for good, but no, they're back. We'll also talk about Citroën, which is launching a new campaign to reduce the price of its cars, with discounts that can reach several thousand euros. We'll also talk about Leapmotor, the Chinese brand from the Stellantis group, which plans to enter the European market with a new engine technology. It's still very rare for now. We'll also discuss Hyundai, which surprised everyone yesterday by revealing a new hardcore 4x4 off-road model. And finally, we'll talk about dealer self-registrations. Dealer self-registrations are when dealers register cars themselves. Sometimes it's for their employees, but sometimes it's also just to save face a little and to show registration numbers on their balance sheet that are much higher than reality. The dealer self-registration figures for the first quarter of 2026 have just been released, and there's a big winner. It's Stellantis. We'll talk more about it and go into detail in a moment, but there are clearly some brands within the group that have seriously overused tactical registrations. These are the topics of this video. I hope you'll find it interesting. If that's the case, as usual, I'm counting on you to show your support by leaving a like, subscribing for the next videos, boosting this one if you have the option, and of course, by leaving a comment where you share your thoughts on today's news. Today, we're going to talk again about a topic we haven't discussed in a long time: the LEZs, the famous low-emission zones. Let me quickly remind you of the concept. In several cities in France, these zones have appeared, and the idea is to ban access to certain cities for cars considered too old. It's based on the Crit-Air system. These are small stickers that are based on the year your car was made and the type of energy it uses, whether it's diesel, electricity, or gasoline. They are used to categorize your car and indicate which city it is allowed to enter or not. Let me remind you that this system is completely absurd, since it puts a Ferrari with a huge engine and a tiny Renault Twingo on the same level. This is because the system doesn't take actual emissions into account.
Véhiculent simplement leur année et leur...
The LEZs didn't cause too many problems at first, except that now we've reached the year 2025, and the French government planned for all cities with 150,000 inhabitants to implement LEZs. And that's when a large part of the French population woke up. They realized that overnight their car would simply no longer be allowed in the city where they work or the city where they live. In some cities, there was talk of banning Crit-Air 4 cars, and in others, even going as far as banning Crit-Air 3 cars, or at least restricting their circulation. That still represents about 10 million vehicles in France. 10 million, which is roughly a quarter of the French car fleet, that are Crit-Air 3 or higher. So technically, it was almost 10 million French people who would have had to change their car just to go to work or to get home. So obviously, it's a project that was largely rejected by the vast majority of French people, considered deeply unfair, and seen more as an economic and ecological measure to encourage the French to buy newer cars, especially electric cars, which for now still aren't selling very well. It caused a big stir, and in response to the discontent, different political parties ended up voting to abolish these LEZs. As we somewhat suspected, the government is pushing these LEZs again, and for several weeks now, they've been working very discreetly in collaboration with Les Républicains on a new amendment that would allow them not to completely abolish the LEZs. By transferring the responsibility for implementing these LEZs from the national government to the municipalities, which means that it would be the mayors who would decide whether the LEZs would be applicable or not in their city. Just imagine the mess if you live in a town where all of a sudden, a green mayor decides to implement the LEZs, only to be replaced a few years later by another mayor who decides to get rid of them. In the meantime, it's the only way the government has found to keep the LEZs alive, so that the project isn't a complete failure. So, we'll see if it goes through or not. We'll see if the mayors decide to reinstate the LEZs in their cities or not. In the meantime, since this announcement, several members of parliament have publicly and officially stated that this compromise is based on a very fragile majority, that it would probably come down to just a few votes. And even if this compromise was accepted and voted on, there was absolutely no guarantee it would be implemented, because that's the last trick. The ZFE project, which is currently under review, isn't in a separate LEZ-specific bill. It is included in a comprehensive law on simplifying economic life, which covers a whole range of topics that have absolutely nothing to do with LEZs. So even if the return of LEZs through city governments was approved, it is entirely possible that this economic simplification law could later be rejected by the National Assembly or by the Senate, which must then approve the entire text. To finish with this topic on a positive note, it is still said that since the government absolutely needs to have the economic simplification law approved, if at the last moment the amendments on the ZFE were considered too divisive, they could be completely dropped to pass the rest of the law, which would mean that LEZs would, for now, remain completely scrapped. We'll need to be more patient to see how this turns out. Since the debates in the National Assembly on LEZs, and especially on the economic simplification law, will resume starting April 13, or in about 10 days, we'll have a fairly quick idea about the future of LEZs. Over at Hyundai, they created a surprise last night by publicly and officially revealing a new vehicle. It's part of a category where we're absolutely not used to seeing Hyundai, the Hyundai Boulder. So, unfortunately for now, there isn't much information about it, except that, unfortunately, it's expected to arrive on the market around the 2030s. What we know is that with a vehicle like this, Hyundai is directly targeting competitors like Mercedes, the G-Class, or even Land Rover, both aesthetically and in terms of its off-road capabilities. It was actually built on a ladder frame chassis, which is, let's say, a pretty typical chassis. Off-road vehicles and pickups are usually more durable, particularly regarding torsion. This makes it easier to tackle particularly steep roads, often allows for much better towing capabilities, and overall, they are much more robust than traditional chassis. On a ladder frame chassis, the chassis and vehicle body are two separate parts assembled together. Unlike other vehicles where the body is generally directly part of the structure, this allows the chassis to absorb all the physical stresses without them ever affecting the body of the vehicle. I also wanted to quickly tell you about Leapmotor. It's the Chinese brand of the Stellantis group, which, by the way, the group is backing heavily. They plan to bring range extender models to Europe. This engine type is still very rare in Europe. Let me briefly explain the concept. These are electric cars that have a combustion engine running on gasoline, which works like a generator to directly produce electricity on board the vehicle while it's operating to recharge the batteries. The goal is to drive in fully electric mode as often and as long as possible, while boosting the vehicle's total range thanks to the use of gasoline. The first model to benefit from this technology at Leapmotor in Europe will be the B10 SUV in the EREV version, which is the English acronym for range extender. It will come standard with a rather small 18.8 kilowatt electric battery paired with a 1.5L gasoline engine, which, I repeat, will never directly drive the wheels, but only serves to recharge the batteries. We'll see how that works out in the long run. Range extenders. It's true that on paper the numbers seem a bit ridiculous, because without using gasoline, the B10 can only travel 82 kilometers in 100% electric mode. Beyond that, it basically works a bit like a plug-in hybrid. Since taxes are now punitive for plug-in hybrids, but not for range extenders, many European manufacturers are starting to show interest in range extenders. For now, Stellantis hasn't announced the price of this version of the B10, but of course, as soon as they do, I'll share it with you in a video. By the way, since we're talking about Stellantis, I have two final topics to share with you in this video that concern them. One that specifically concerns Citroën. From April 1st until the end of the month, Citroën is launching an additional trade-in bonus, which, in exchange for trading in a vehicle that's 8 years old or more, offers a bonus when purchasing a new Citroën, which can go up to 6,000 euros. And the good news is that unlike what other brands have done recently, this discount, which goes up to 6,000 euros, applies to the entire range. And not just on electric cars, it also applies to combustion engine and hybrid vehicles. In reality, the amount of the discount will depend on the Citroën vehicle you want to buy. I'll show you the list during editing, but the maximum is for the C4 hybrid and the C4 electric. And with a 6,000 euro discount, the entry-level C4 hybrid costs 23,800 euros. It's still expensive considering the purchasing power of the French, but it still puts this C4 hybrid among the cheapest new vehicles on the current French car market. And finally, speaking a bit about the French car market, I wanted to talk to you about dealer self-registrations. I briefly explained what that was in the introduction of this video. These are cars that are registered by dealerships but aren't actually sold. They help inflate the registration numbers. On paper, it makes it look like everything is going well in terms of sales and helps avoid a short-term drop in market share and, let's say, reassures investors a little bit. The brand that relied the least on dealer self-registrations in Europe is Tesla, with only 2.3%, which also makes sense since Tesla doesn't really have dealerships. Is that right? Dealer self-registrations are problematic because you still need space to store the vehicles. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there's Mitsubishi with 74% of its registrations coming from dealer self-registrations, but honestly, Mitsubishi is really such a niche brand. Now, it's hard to really consider them as a truly mainstream brand in their own right. Even more concerning, many mainstream brands remain at the bottom of the ranking. Among Stellantis brands, Citroën with 40% dealer self-registrations and Peugeot with 42%. And despite that, I remind you that in March 2026, Peugeot was still at 11%, in a market that was expected to be up about 12% overall. So there's clearly a problem. Peugeot, DS 43% Fiat, 43%, Lancia 45% Jeep, 51%, Opel 56%. Indeed, Stellantis at the beginning of 2026 showed some nice little registration numbers, but in reality, there are still quite a few cars that simply aren't sold at all. Either way, they weren't sold at first. Maybe they've found buyers since, but for Stellantis, nothing's certain yet. That's the news for April 3rd. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please like, subscribe for future videos, and consider supporting me via the join button below. See you tomorrow for the weekend's first video. Ciao.